What do you think the European institutions could do to concretely increase this political trust and interest for the young people at the European level? Because we only see more at the national level rather than the European level.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because that's also something we're working on, actually. We have something we worked on that's called the youth test. So ideally what it is put it simple, is a screening process of every single piece of legislation or directive or recommendation coming from the EU institutions. And the idea behind that is that it gets screened to see the sustainability of that, and how is it sustainable for young people, first of all, and is it youth-centered? So are young people also involved in that set of legislation? Are their views being taken into account? Are we going to have to change that legislation in the next 5 years, 10 years, and then be sustainable for the future generations of young people? So I think that is something that, if that does get implemented, I do believe young people will start seeing that the institutions are actually listening. We are a big chunk of the demographic at the end of the day. All policies must actually be tailored also with young people at its core, because we're young today, but then tomorrow there'll be other set of young people, another set of young people, another set of young people, and demographic will still be big of that representation of society. So I think that our youth test that we're developing, of course, we have a lot more on it on our website, youthfront.org, so that there's a lot more information on there. But I do believe the youth test could be a good start, at least, to gain that trust back with the EU. With youth organizations and national youth councils and young people in a more general manner.
Thank you for informing that. I really did not, I was not aware of this youth test. I don't know about the two of you, but yeah, interesting to know. But now we have come to the second part of our discussion. I wanted to bring our discussion more to the topic of underrepresentation of the youth in EU decision-making process. Previously, we have touched about the election process. Now, I wanted to look at actual representation of the young people within the decision-making process of the EU, how they can actually influence the legislation process. And according to the 2022 studies, young people are actually the most underrepresented age group in the European Parliament. Currently, the average age of MEPs is 49 years. The results of this analysis show that only 6% of the elected MEPs were under 35. So there's a disparity between this number of the elected representatives and the actual share of the approximately 20% of the European population under 35. Disparity, of course, implies that there is a gap in the descriptive representation with the critical policy implications. I wanted to ask you, Ismail, why do you think youth is still underrepresented in the EU institution, despite significantly having increased participation in the election in 2019?
Well, we're talking about, if it comes to political representation and decision-making places, like might be the European Parliament, for instance, it's actually quite funny because there are only 6 MEPs under the age of 30 in the European Parliament, and there are more people called Martin in the European Parliament than people aged under 30. So they can see how many few people there are. And this comes back to the thing I said before, is if we actually commit to lowering the voting age to 16, young people will get engaged from a lot earlier. So give them like a buffer, let's say, to get more engaged in politics and get better prepared, let's say, better suited to really get into a decision-making levels, whether it's on local level, regional, national, even international, European Union level, EU level. So it's mainly because of that. It's mainly because the life is starting a bit later now. People aren't getting as politically active as when they should, which is actually around 16. So, yeah, I do believe that if we lower, let's say, the age to 16, maybe we'll get more under 30 young leaders, young politicians in the EU institutions. And that's one of the best answers I can give, really.
Yeah, I can only also relate to the Malaysian experience, because they had this campaign to lower the voting age from, I think, 21 to 17. And that's also, of course, the argument for that is, of course, when people start earlier, they don't already, get into their job, this lifestyle, that they don't care anymore about politics and life hits and so on. So, of course, this lowering of age for voting is very important. I want to get to you, Clara. What do you feel as the effects of this underrepresentation in the decision-making process as European youth?
So I believe about lowering the voting age. I do think it would be impactful, but I think a lot starts also with the whole framework of political parties. And for instance, when we come to European elections, parties being willing to put young candidates on their lists. I think there is a big internal problem in political parties in wanting young people to exceed, because there are a lot of biases and towards maybe the experience or the competence of young people. That's at least the feeling that I got. So they're vastly underrepresented in parties, but maybe also don't have the same career opportunities than people with more experience or who are older. And it's so important that young people are represented in the decision-making process, because the policy areas that concern young people are those that are going to affect their lives in the long term, right? So we see that youth, and we mentioned this a couple of times now in the podcast, that youth is very active in political activism, but it's not incorporated into the political decision-making process to the same extent. And I mean, policy areas that concern youth are a lot like social issues or the climate crisis. A lot of relevant things that would contribute to improving society. And I really think that the lack of representation at the European level is probably also a big reason why youth feels frustrated, or the youth feels frustrated to, you have the feeling that if you're going to vote, what's my vote going to change? What impact am I going to have in the actually policy-making process if my age group is not represented at the decision-making level? Young people often lose trust in the fact that their policy interests are actually going to be represented.
Lara mentioned about the lack of engagement of the political parties to the young people. Would you say this is also observed by the youth organizations, and has there been something done to actually tackle that issue?
To include young people in political parties, you mean, or
yes.
To what extent? Mm-hmm. Actually, it's good. Yes, that question was good. I want to come back to what she was saying. I'm half Spanish, half English, so those political systems are quite different when it comes to it. But we can speak about all the systemic barriers and the logistical issues and why, young people can't access either voting and and all this. That's fine. But one of the biggest issues is also culturally speaking. When you have, for instance, closed lists in some countries, you usually get to the state where you can represent the party in elections out of seniority. So it's usually the more you are there, the more you climb up. It's not really based on meritocracy, on your ideas or what you're willing to do for the party or for the people you represent. It's mainly who do you know and for how long you've been there. So usually when you're young, you don't really get there. They're not going to put you on the list. You just have to wait your turn, right? There's no actual will. So this can be remediated, actually. The parties need to be a little bit more, I'm not going to say culturally open, but to the extent that wanting to engage young people, because they can actually see the benefit from it. There are benefits in here. We're not just demanding things to say, okay, yeah, just include young people and you're not going to benefit from it. They actually will benefit from it. There will be people who actually get more interested. And again, if we're speaking purely political strategy here, that's what makes sense. If you want to get people more involved, people more open to vote, involve young people in your list. They're going to feel more identified with that. People will get more identified with what they know. And if they see a young person from a specific background and say, oh, okay, well, I feel identified with that person. As for us, of course, I mean, all our platforms are youth-led. Our board members are youth-led. We're all young people. We all come from very, very different backgrounds. I personally come from civil society background, from a volunteering background, from NGO background. So I don't come from a political background. Other young people from our board come from political backgrounds, more politically active platforms or organizations. Me, not so much, right? So we are a very diverse group of young people, and we always involve each other. We always represent each other, let's say. So no, we don't. We ourselves are the perfect representation of that, and how we manage to work around that. Being young people, working for young people, and being represented by young people, and our platforms very well represent that, I believe. So if you want to get good examples, any single one of our platforms, any single one of our member organizations, national youth councils, even the European Youth Forum itself is a great example on how we involve young people in our internal processes. Again, all of our recommendations, papers, studies, campaigns, they're not just our ideas of the European Youth Forum per se, but they're ideas of the whole European Youth Forum. So all the members, all the national youth councils, and all these are young people. So we do have our internal processes.